So welcome to the fourth lesson that we're having on the topic of Madhyamaka. And in this particular study, as you've noticed, it's a lot about juxtaposing the Svatantrika and the Prasangika Madhyamaka. And it makes a lot of sense because generally the Prasangikas are very well known. But in effect, everybody is practicing the Svatantrika, this gradual approach, particularly with regards to, well, I should say rather, what we've covered so far is very much continually pertaining to the way that the Svatantrikas, they approach absolute truth. And this is very, very valuable. And in fact, everybody does it. But it's very good as soon as we begin to juxtapose things, identify the tension between two, you could say, positions, everything becomes much clearer. We begin to understand more what they're talking about. For example, in the general Prasangika statement, all phenomena are free from inherent existence, it might not mean that much. But once we begin to identify then things like, for example, when we say that, what's left? What does that mean in terms of our experience? And when we say everything doesn't have inherent existence, well, supposedly there's somebody who knows that, right? And knowing that comes with certain qualities. So it's not as if we would just say, oh, everything is empty and that's it. In fact, discovering that, well, if we're sitting in front of a movie and we get wound up in it, the moment that we discover and we catch ourselves, recognize, oh, this is just a movie, we can kind of relax. It's a whole different experience. And of course, what's implicit here is with all our, you could say, dualistic attitudes and all the afflicted emotions and all the karmic patterns that come from that, we end up having a very limited experience. We diminish ourselves and we suffer. And that's what's called samsara. And so the Buddha, seeing that we needn't suffer, he taught a path. And what we're very much then, you could say, uncovering here is the way that we uncover and understand what it is that we're uncovering. But it's very important to understand that with the diminishing of confusion, we're removing some obscurations and we're going to be seeing far more. So we're opening up to a greater vision. So anyway, as far as then our study goes, we presently are then onto a chapter that's known as the Vajrayana and Madhyamaka. Yeah. Madhyamaka and Vajrayana. So I'm going to cut the video here and let's just see. And then we're going to be going on to here. So again, just recognizing that with the study of the middle way, we are aiming towards enlightenment. And even though we don't attain perfect enlightenment, we're gaining some insight that is going to be very helpful in terms of understanding the world. And so what we're doing here is not about us, it's about all sentient beings. So vowing to never abandon any of them, we then generate the motivation. I will study and integrate the middle way teaching to bring all sentient beings to perfect enlightenment. And in doing this, we're not alone. We're drawing on the expertise and the experience and a living tradition that we call then lineage. And this is our lineage. Of course, we can identify with all sorts of subcultures and our own nationality and our family and all sorts of various reference points for belonging. But as far as enlightenment goes, and as far as you could say our innate disposition of wisdom goes, we're actually part of a living tradition that originates with Lord Buddha and some great sages. And what's, you could say, particularly about these are that they uncovered what we're aiming to uncover. So these are very much our reference points in terms of our project of unveiling our innate disposition of basic goodness. So there's Lord Buddha, Nagarjuna, Buddha Palita, Bhavivika, Chandrakirti, Shantarakshita, and Kamalashila. And these are just a few, but these are important in the present discussion. And we're going to be also drawing on the works of greatly inspired. There's not so much reference so far to Rongzum Pandita, but he greatly inspired both Longchen Rabjam and Jamgun Mipam. And of course, we're particularly drawing on Jamgun Mipam. So just to recap, and this is again this tension between the two approaches, which is actually quite helpful. So as far as the Prasangika and Svatantrika go, the Prasangika, they emphasize wisdom of meditative equipoise, for which the two truths are one taste. And that's generally also what we could then call the uncountable absolute. And then the second is supreme knowledge of post-meditation, for which the two truths are distinctly discerned. And so in terms of the two truths, then we begin to talk about the way that we understand how two truths operate. And that's the Svatantrika approach. Now, as modern people, I think it's really important that we're not approaching this as Buddhists or card-carrying, members of some Madhyamaka foundation or what have you, but we're really just looking into reality. We are doing this with a spirit of inquiry, and we're encouraged to inquire and bring all our doubt and critical thinking to that. The science that we're exploring here has to do with our subjective dimension. It's not just our ordinary subjective dimension, but the potential of our psychology. And so we could possibly speak of an expanded phenomenology of awakening. And what that is about lies beyond the ordinary rationality. So we are very much operating with qualities of the human existence that normally are not subject to, you could say, structured cultivation and so forth, like compassion, wisdom, all these things that have a lot to do with things that are not linear. And this is extremely important. Love, all of that. So you could say, when we're speaking about enlightenment, we're talking about something that is not, isn't ruled by the intellect, but it is so much something that we are in control of and something that we can do something about. So there's very much a path, and this path is very much informed by our inspiration that comes from faith. And so, yes, we use logic here to eventually provide a foundation of certainty that leads to trust and faith in what is beyond ordinary linear structure and logic. Specifically then, we are, in the name of logic, we are studying the Madhyamaka, which is actually an uncompromising, I wouldn't say ruthless, but compassionate, but nevertheless effective and radical refutation of flawed sciences. And particularly in the areas of the subjective and the philosophical, it's very often sort of left as a gray zone, and there's this assumption that some of these things we could never know. But I mean, we can see what's valid, what brings happiness, what brings suffering, what brings a greater vision, and what doesn't. So presently, then, we're in the chapter, it's called Madhyamaka and the Vajrayana. And Vajrayana is extremely important. It's really the culmination of the Buddhist path. And particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana is very visible. Now, in approaching that, we should simply understand that Madhyamaka is not different. And Madhyamaka is not really different from anything. I mean, Madhyamaka really means the middle way. So this middle way is the place where we begin to relinquish our dogmas and our assumptions, where we begin to let go of, you could say, our basic insecurity and self-clinging and objectification of the objective dimension, and on a sort of just on a regular habitual level, but we also eliminate this through the practice of the path, and that's where we need to appreciate what the Buddha's path is about, that it's not about some new philosophy or dogma. So in that sense, Madhyamaka is very much onto eliminating the dogmatic positions of philosophy in general. But this doesn't mean that we say, okay, there's no truth or, all of that. It's more that we understand truth is ultimately beyond the scope of the mind. So that we find everywhere in Buddhism. So we could say this Madhyamaka, the middle way, is the foundation of all the various Buddhist vehicles that we have. And specifically then talking in a Nyingma context, and here the Khenpo specifically then talk about how the Madhyamaka is the basis for the Vajrayana. And in fact, the great perfection, Dzogchen, which very often seems to be beyond anything whatsoever, that is actually nothing but taking onto the path. This is actually, you could say, Dzogchen is being introduced to the uncountable absolute and making that one's path. And that's also, as we now see, this is where this is very helpful. We see, hey, nature of mind, it sounds easy, but it's actually not that sort of simple. And that's where the countable absolute, some idea of what it is that we're deconstructing and what it is that we're looking for, that's very helpful. So this is very much something that serves as a foundation for the Dzogchen teaching and also for Vajrayana in general. I mean, when we're practicing Vajrayana, we are taking wisdom as the path. It might be somewhat conceptualized in the sense of visualization, but at the same time, we also dissolve this visualization and we settle into the completion stage practice. And that, we could say, is synonymous with the great perfection and also with the Madhyamaka. So there are two ways that we then approach this middle way, or the understanding of emptiness. And this is just general. I mean, the Madhyamaka is talking about, you could say, the big picture, the big important thing, the realization of emptiness, the realization of Rigpa, the realization of wisdom, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, what have you. But there's the way that we do this is that the Dzogchen, it introduces this nature through the experience. And that's for the qualified student, someone who has devotion, somebody who has been processed by the path, has, you could say, relinquished their own, you could say, self-fixation, embraced the cause of all sentient beings and has such a magnanimous spirit. Such a person then will be a worthy vessel for introduction to Dzogchen. And the Madhyamaka, as we're finding it here, it actually does the same, but it does it through reasoning. And this is very good for all of us who've been drilled through primary, secondary, and tertiary educations. We cannot deny that we are driven by reason. We'd be fooling ourselves if we think, oh yeah, we're just beyond. I mean, sure, great yogis, there will be some, and they don't have to be big and famous. There's many humble yogis, but they actually are not caught by any kind of conceptualization. We're rarely like that. I mean, if we can do it, it's great, but like the other day, Sansa Genzo Rinpoche, he was talking about how, just settling into this, we might just end up kidding ourselves. And so there has to be some way of integrating our understanding, and we do that with this approach. So we do establish, you could say, the logical, the scientific reasons why, in fact, nothing has inherent existence the way we think it has. So that's why we look at the mind, we look inward, and using reasoning, we look, can we find anything that truly can be objectified as truly existing, as in terms of what we think of, for example, as our person, and also the external objective world. And that's where we begin, when we begin to have the logic that tells us, We're assuming something, and if we let go of these thoughts and narratives that consolidate these assumptions and just settle into a simplicity as per our practice of meditation, hey, this feels right, this looks right, this is in concordance with the teachings. And that's where we can begin to have some certainty about the view. So there's two approaches. One is through experience, and the other is using the rational mind. The objective is the same, but the methods, they differ. Now, as far as when we talk about the two truths, it's important that we understand that this really covers everything that we looked at last time. We're not denying anything in terms of relative truth. You know, cars drive, airplanes fly, you know, we sleep, eat, and all of that. We live ordinary lives. All of that, yes, and that can be, of course, if we're scientists or we're making analysis or whatever, yes, we can understand the human existence in so many different ways. But what we're talking about here is, how does delusion originate? The subject and object, you could say, divide, and duality, and the cause of suffering. And that's where, when we look at phenomena, they appear, yet they have no truth. So you could say the nature of what we experience, the relative phenomena, their absolute nature is there's nothing that we can objectify about them. And so in this way, the two truths, they pervade all aspects. And they're not two different things. See, when we say the aspect of appearance and emptiness, they're united in the phenomena, that means things exist without, there's part of them that's the appearance aspect, some is emptiness. It's just like, you could say, a rainbow. It's not as if there's the insubstantiality of the rainbow on one hand and then the colors and so on the other. And likewise also, any given phenomena that we analyze, it's like we say, it doesn't withstand analysis. We can't find an essence, but it's still there. A chair is still a chair, even though we can take it apart. So it's only us who make the difference. It's only us who introduce what Tsontsukyan Rinpoche calls, we divorce appearance and emptiness. But in and of themselves, phenomena just exist as they are. They don't think I am this, I'm that. So moreover, what we're going to look at here today, and that's where we begin to use analysis, we can say phenomena beyond singularity, like we think of ourselves or objects as just units. But in fact, if we begin to look into these units, they consist of, you know, more subtle units and subtle particles, and all the way down, and we can keep on going down, and there's nothing that will not somehow be something that we could say has a left and a right and an up and a down. And so we'll never find anything that has absolute, you could say, is an absolute unit. And so without that, even that we begin to think of many different things, also there's no basis for that. So we think of ourselves as units, but in fact we're not. We're made out of many different things, and we're also not many different things. We're basically thinking, I think Jakob. And so when we analyze and see that there is made up of many different things, it's not as if Jakob is many different things either. So when we apply this analysis, also, and this is what we call absolute investigation, absolute analysis, we see that there's actually nothing there. Now, I'm still Jakob, and there's still the chair, there's still phenomena, but it's just when we apply analysis in terms of what things truly are. And this is not about philosophy, like I'm always saying. This is about where we begin to create the cause of suffering, when we objectify and get rigid about me, and we get rigid and fixated on the other and objects. That's where we go wrong. It's not that we've done anything wrong, we're greedy or attached or selfish and anything. It's just we're confused. And that's where this analysis is very helpful, understanding the absolute truth of phenomena. So understanding absolute truth is just understanding the way things are. So understanding, you know, if you're talking with the Dalai Lama and a bus goes by, you ask the Dalai Lama, what's that? He's not going to say, well, that's, you know, a conceptual construct that is emptiness. He's just going to say it's a bus. And we also see the bus. Now, the difference between us and the Dalai Lama is that we might have all sorts of likes and dislikes and so on. Not, it's not just that we have thoughts and we think that the bus is pollutant or it shouldn't be there or whatever. That's not the point. The thing is, with objects, we see the same objects as the Buddhas, but what we have is this like and dislike and all of that. So that's where we lose our wisdom. So to have this insight, the absolute truth, is essential. And that's why we apply the analysis that we're going to do. We're going to have quite a bit of analysis here. We're warming up to analysis and reasoning. So in Vajrayana, we continually understand how phenomena, they exist as the unity of appearance and emptiness. And how, in fact, the way that we objectify phenomena is ignorance, both with regards to ourself and with regards to the object. Overlooking that emptiness of phenomena, the way that we overlooking it when we objectify things, cling to them, and so on, we miss phenomena. We miss seeing what they actually are, and that, you could say, in the Vajrayana, we actually regard the experience of emptiness as the consort. There is the appearance, and there is the natural arising of, you could say, perceptions, natural arising of the subjective dimension, and so on. That happens, yes, and that we call the skillful means of appearance. But when that is embraced by the understanding of emptiness, then we have this lack of alienation between self and other, and that's where you can say the ordinary struggle we have between me and the other and me and my objects, that's lost. Then there's just bliss. And so the Vajrayana Yab-Yum image is very important actually as symbolizing how, you could say, the self and other, when it's embraced by non-duality, it actually is bliss. And so the sexual union is a metaphor for that. So when you have all the Yab-Yum in Vajrayana, it's not just, you could say, clergy wanting to sanctify the libidinous urgings or some, excuse for having sex, but it's a very profound metaphor for this bliss of non-duality. And here then, when we look at the male, that's just nothing to do with gender. It's just the subjective and the appearing aspect, that's the male, and the wisdom, the lack of anything that can be objectified, that is then the female. And the two of them together then in the union of bliss is then, you could say, a metaphor for the nature of reality in which appearance and emptiness are unified. So this unity of appearance and emptiness is also sometimes referred to as the unity of space and wisdom. Space being the absolute space, yin in Tibetan, dhatu or dhamma dhatu, and wisdom, jhana or yeshe. So you could say all the inner tantras, they're all about this. In the Nyingma teachings, you have Mahanunati, and all of these teachings operate with this unity of space and wisdom. And in that context, then, we're never ever operating with the sense that we're here and enlightenment is somewhere else. We're operating with that enlightenment is here, and this nature of space and wisdom is our ground nature. And reality doesn't shift. We just have to recognize it. But that's where practices like visualization and so forth are very helpful. So this basically is then the view of the higher tantras, Mahanu and Ati, and then within that, particularly then Ati, we refer to as Dzogchen, the great perfection. So now that was fun, right? Now we have to we're going from the Yab-Yum and the unity of space and wisdom. We're going to have to do some little bit of hard yards here. And it's not that hard, really. But this is, we're not just sort of romantics that are sort of, just deciding that everything is space and wisdom, everything is just the non-dual unity of Yab and Yum. But we're actually basing this on understanding reality. And so there's two ways that we understand reality, and that when we're understanding reality, it means we're just looking beyond the appearance, beyond the superficial level of truth, and we're looking at this absolute truth. Now, this absolute truth is something that can be understood, and that's called countable, and it can also be that which is the scope of the sage, which is realization, and that is uncountable. We also sometimes say categorized and uncategorized. It's namjang pe dam and namjang main pe dam, these two. So the first of these, and this has a lot to do with the approach of the Svatantrika. This countable is established with two insights. There's two things we see. And so the first is that we analyze and we look at any given phenomenon and we see they don't possess any self-nature. That's fairly easy. We just look and we apply logic and we just see, hey, that chair is made out of stuff. There's no essence in it. Similar for the person, similar for any given phenomenon. And we understand that. And then also when we consolidate that further continually with using logic and reasoning, and that's where we get a little bit critical. It's not just that we say, hey, this is how things are, but we also begin to see where we go wrong, and we begin to see where in our, you could even say our communal discourse, or in the way that we talk about things in ordinary life, that we have some assumptions that are just plain wrong. And for one thing, that is then this is where we can apply the Madhyamaka reasoning. I remember Tonsakan's Rinpoche once, when I was studying this, he said to me, watch out, you're going to end up being argumentative when you study this. You might pick arguments easily. And that you could say is just that we're beginning to be vaccinated against some of the myths and assumptions. Well, what's very helpful here is then the logic and the reasoning based on singularity. We can see, we think things are unitary, but they're not if we analyze. And understanding that things don't have any absolute sort of essence, then the whole assumption about that things that build up of many different things, that also doesn't really exist. There's nothing actually that truly exists as either singular or plural. So we don't find anything singular. I am complex, phenomena are complex, you are complex. Forget about being something singular. And plural, well, we actually look at phenomena and we say, hey, that is a chair. So we actually we know then that the chair is made up of many different things, but it's not as if any of those individual units, the leg, the back of the chair, the seat of the chair, it's not as if that is the chair either. So either way we look at it, singularity or plurality, we penetrate right through the assumptions that we have. So this is where this logic is very helpful. It enables us to acquire certainty about the nature of reality. Now, in the adornment of the middle way, there's actually, this is not fair, I only put Padmakaras. I'm sort of a little bit, I guess it's just my slight bias, but actually I would like to say there's another one that's called the, Manjughosha's, the Manjushri's Speech of Delight. It's Thomas Doctor's translation of the same work. It's really good. And also there's a guy, there was James Blumenthal, who also translated some of it. Maybe all, but he was working on a commentary by Gyaltsab Jain. He probably translated the root text as well. I haven't looked at it. But anyway, this work has, there's at least 2, if not 3 translations in English of this text. And the first verse in this work, and this comes from Shantarakshita, says, the entities that our and other schools affirm, since they exist inherently in neither singular nor plural, In ultimate reality, they're without intrinsic being. They're like reflections. So this is where the logic of Chandrarakshita, it runs as a red thread through this entire work. But it just means that, yes, we all accept that there are chairs and vases and people and what have you. And if we look at them, in ultimate reality, there's nothing ultimately, like I say, there's no intrinsic being or inherent existence. So things appear, we're not denying that, but they're no more real than reflections. So when we look at this quote, then the first three lines, they actually talk about the absolute truth. And this we established through the logic of the singular and plural, neither singular nor plural. And then the last one is just a statement about relative truths. So that's like reflections. But you see, again, this is where the Svatantrika approach is, that we actually establish some thesis about what's relative and absolute. So when it comes to the refutation that we're using here, when we investigate anything, we begin with analysis. And in fact, as soon as we use analysis, ladies and gentlemen, as soon as you use the why, how come, any time that we bring in that analytical, you could say, edge, things come undone. When you start asking why, things become complex, Otherwise, like I said last time, we'd have nothing to debate over the coffees. So as soon as you introduce analysis, try and notice how things all of a sudden, they dissolve, because all of a sudden there's 2 views, 3 views, infinite views. Things can be seen endlessly because they're just relative phenomena. They're only perceived according to, they exist on the basis of the observer that imputes some reality on. So when we look at phenomena in and of themselves, then we say with analysis we establish how nothing, subject and object, has inherent existence. And we do that when we, for example, look at the one who's observing, let's say the subject. So we think of ourselves as a unit, right? Not as several persons. I mean, I'm made up of many different things, right? My body and my mind and so on. But then is there a Jakob that's mind and a Jakob that's body? So we think of ourselves as a singular entity. But then again, let's analyze. We see we're composites, we're constructs that we've done many times. For example, the terms of the 5 skandhas and the outer external realm as the 5 elements. And then again, in terms of time, we're not the same as we were 10 years ago. We're not the same as we will be 10 years from now. We're presently made up of this body and mind, and each of these have countless parts. The body has countless parts. Mind has countless aspects. So we also, with that, we begin to say my house, my this, my so on and so forth, my that, and all of this, my, and all the concern around that reinforces this sense of a singular me. So it's not just us, but all beings have that. And this fundamental delusion is what creates our suffering. Now, we should notice how universally we try to establish something absolute. And that, of course, is what all philosophers will say, and particularly in modern context and postmodern context, like, oh yeah, well, that's just the philosophical project. We've abandoned that because there is no such a thing as truth, right? And so you could say, yes, that's right. We all do it habitually and even philosophically. And this is what Madhyamaka is getting at, not because it's bad, but it's because it's what drives suffering and drives insecurity and so on and so forth, And that's also what, for example, Nietzsche is all about, the slave individual who has to have something to hold on to, but the real, the superhuman doesn't need these kind of artificial crutches. So there's a lot of aspiration actually to go beyond that, but we have to humbly acknowledge that we actually do it, and we do it in all sorts of ways. And in the end, even postmodern claims of there's nothing, that becomes a huge, if you ask me, straitjacket and a huge burden. But if we look at then the various doctrines, you can see that, yes, this is the objective of the philosophies, and we have to acknowledge that modern philosophy to a large extent then has abandoned these metaphysical ideas. But the thing is, and what we're doing here is even, yes, in Buddhism also we abandon the idea of truth as something that can be objectified. But you see, there is still a truth factor in the validity of that observation. And that, you could say, is part of this expanded phenomenology of awakening. See, that brings about lack of clinging to self, and it liberates qualities of compassion, and it liberates our perception. That's the big picture, but you could say, yes, in Buddhism we also do have various ways of establishing some overarching principles. So you have the Vaibhashika school and the Sautrantika schools in Buddhism, and they, just as we have it in classical physics, the notion that there is some building block of phenomena, and also they assert some consciousness that exists. And then again, the mind only, they go a bit further. They just say everything is mind, everything. There's no external objects. There's no real self. All of it is just a mind that's either confused or enlightened, but it's all mind. And this is again also a way of attempting to create some unity. And the thing is, if duality is a false construct, then non-duality must be valid. So this kind of non-duality, that's what the mind-only school, they posit as absolute. Can't blame them, right? But even if we go into the Madhyamaka, even the two truths, they can be seen as some sort of subtle position like that. And that is, of course, also the Prasangika argument about the Svatantrika. Now, all of this has value. You could say in terms of just method. But as far as what we're doing, then we're aiming to go beyond that. Mind you, even Madhyamaka is guilty of this. And if you read in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in the chapter called Introducing Naked Awareness, then Padmasambhava says, the adherents of Madhyamaka are obscured by their attachment to the extremes of the two truths. Huh? And at the end here in this chapter, Khenchen Palden Sherab, he also says, the true nature is completely free of subject and object. Yeah? But see, then we've said the true nature, isn't it? So there is temporarily, for, heuristic or for just a skillful means, we use this kind of language. But of course, ultimately, we need to go beyond language. And that's where also it's essential then that we practice meditation. Otherwise, this just remains theory. So that's refuting singularity. Refuting plurality. So Shantarikshita, he's refuting the idea of an absolute. So with nothing singular, nothing can be plural. Yeah, we can't find anything that's absolute, singular. Even quarks and the Higgs boson or whatever, they still, if we find something, we can still talk about, the top, the bottom, the left, and the right, and so on. And that means that it's not as if it's undivided. So as there's nothing that truly exists as indivisible, then also nothing can be built by that. So for example, if we say that we have the number 12, it's really dependent on just that there is singular units, that there's truly a one. Now, we're not denying that there's phenomena, Higgs bosons and quarks and numbers and all of that. We're not denying that. We're just saying they don't have absolute value. In absolute, there's nothing that we can ultimately objectify. And so the idea of plurality also falls apart, because that's assuming that there is something that's built by, you could say, truly existing units. So again, we need to observe this habit that we attribute singularity and true existence on things, that we say there is this. And we're not denying on relative level that this exists, but we're just saying that the solidity and absolute quality that we attribute onto it, that's where we go wrong. So then, okay, so how do things really exist? Well, you could say they exist just relatively. So phenomena, they're agreeable. They just work. The Tibetan, what is it, Nyamgawa or something, Matakna Nyamgawa. It just means if they're not, they're fine. We just leave them alone. So if we're just simple, then phenomena, they're just what they are. No problem if they're not investigated. So phenomena exists as, we have these examples like a rainbow, like a dream, like a mirage, illusions. They appear real, but they're not. Their reality only exists in the individual mind of the observer. Yeah? So the chair is not sitting there thinking, I'm a chair. Its so-called reality is something that I'm imputing, labeling. And likewise also with the observer itself. But that means that we have these, assumptions about the true existence of phenomena, and that's where we need to acknowledge whatever is produced will eventually come undone. So we had that before when we were talking about phenomena, that there's just things arise relatively, and they eventually cease. That's fairly straightforward. And then also, as far as these phenomena go, then they function per appearance and capacity. So a rice seed will obviously give a rice sprout, and eventually the sprout will have the capacity or the function to then become a rice plant. So these are just ways in which the masters, such as Shanta Rakshita and also his teacher Janagaba, they would, you could say, talk about relative phenomena. So they're fine. We needn't argue with anybody. If somebody's not interested in the truth, then hey, we just leave it. Same if we drink a coffee, we just drink it, enjoy it. But if we're going to talk about the true nature of coffee, then there's actually nothing there that we can find that truly exists. So as far as phenomena go, yes, they're there. If they're just agreeable, they're just no problem. Whatever is produced, it'll come to an end, and then they just work. So that's how you could say relative phenomena work. Now, we are honing in on this back and forth between relative and absolute truth. So as far as phenomena go, then all we're saying about absolute truth is just that the phenomena that we perceive, they just lack an absolute self-nature. And in that sense, then, the relative phenomena, they appear real, but they're not. And that lack of truth in phenomena, if you like, that's the absolute truth. It's us who impute who tells the chair it's a chair. In the chair in itself, there's nothing there that actually can be objectified, and that's the real story about the chair. Now, the thing about relative truth is the more that you analyze, the less you find. There was a chair, and then all of a sudden you're left with nothing. If you look at the emotions, you look at anger, and so on, the more that we look, the less anger has a hold on us. By the way, let me just tell you all that I've uploaded in the reading folder a few things that are really great. Couple of things from Mipa Rinpoche on the Madhyamaka arguments that we're going to look at, and also on the notion of selflessness and lack of self, the twofold lack of self. And particularly, actually, I've found a essay. Well, it's a teaching of Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche, which is really helpful if you really want to sort of if you want to really get into this, understand it. then read Khenchen Palden's article about what we're talking about here. Really, really helpful. It particularly applies to what's going to be coming up. So the more we analyze relative truth, then the less we find. Now, looking into the nature of phenomena, then we can understand it intellectually, and you could also say, ultimately, we will arrive at a complete realization of that, which is then uncountable absolute. So when we say countable absolute truth, then yes, actually, we end up with something. You could say, well, we analyze the chair, and the more we look at the chair, then there's nothing, 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 nothing. But the moment that we begin to then discussing nothing, then actually we are beginning to find ways of, you could say, verbalizing and understanding that. And that's where we begin with these big words, emptiness, beyond concepts, and so forth. So you could say there's this paradox that we begin to have something that we then think is real. And of course, that's where we then need to go beyond the countable and go beyond, and then arrive at the uncountable absolute, which is then beyond these labels. As far as the uncountable absolute truth goes, it is what we call great emptiness. See, it's not just that things don't exist as such. There's like what we call a non-affirmative negation, or there's not. It also that there is something great. There's the experience, the inconceivable quality, and that is the great middle way. So this is where we then begin to say, you could say there's a greatness and a manifest, inconceivable quality about realization. So we say mind. You know, the Sanskrit Rinpoche often quotes the Prajnaparamita where he says, mind, there is no mind. The nature of mind is luminosity. So specifically here, when we talk about mind, to quote Khenchen Palden Sherab here, he says, relative truth is none other than our thoughts and mental images. Yeah, me labeling it chair, labeling Jakob or whatever. But where does mind exist? Yeah, it's us who's producing these mental images. Yeah, where? Now, if we look at the mind, we don't find anything at all. Yep, we can't find anything really. And beholding this state, free from speech and concepts, is then, you would say, that's the absolute truth, the last word, the final story. So that's where we say there's a mind that labels, but that mind in itself also cannot be found. Now, the next chapter then is the 5 essentials points on the Yogacarya Madhyamaka, and this is a little bit along the lines of what we've already looked at. So regard this as more a summary. Remember, Yogacarya are the ones that state that all relative phenomena originate on the basis of mind, and as such we have various perceptions. But that's the relative truth. In absolute, there's nothing that we can objectify, and that realization is then the realization of the Madhyamaka. So these two together, Yogacarya and Madhyamaka, is very much the approach of the Svatantrika Madhyamaka. And that is very helpful in terms of us understanding our relative reality. For one, we have then functionality. There are 5 things here. One, functionality. There's an independent self-awareness. There's interiority. This means phenomena exist as mental projections, that everything is within the mind. And then we have then the way of labeling or understanding countable and uncountable absolute truth. And then we have the gradual approach to the uncountable absolute truth. And these are just 5 ways in which you could say there's something really helpful about this particular approach. As far as functionality goes, then Khenchen Palden Sherab says relative truth is none other than our thoughts and mental images. But where does this mind exist? Oh, sorry, that's what I was just reading before. When we look at the mind, we don't find anything at all. Beholding this, I'm not so sure. Let's see. I'm thinking that when I did this, I think yeah. Functionality, sorry, I got the wrong quote in here. So this is just repeat of what I had before. The section that Khenchen Palden Sherab speaks about that I wanted to highlight is that relative phenomena, they function according to their appearance and they carry out specific duties on the relative level. So on page 79, this is bottom of the first paragraph. So they function according to their appearance and they carry out the specific duties on relative level. So that's what we looked at before, actually. Yeah. So that's the first aspect that the Yogacarya emphasize. That's just ordinary relative truth. Yeah. Now, as far as ordinary relative truth goes, it's us individually that has what we call a reflexive or self-awareness. And it's that individual that experiences relative truth. I look at this object in front of me and you look at it and you'll have a different perspective. But all of that indicates that there is a perception, a quality of knowing. And that is then, you could say, what we all operate with. So that knowing is what colors our perceptions, our being. That knowing is, in my case, deeply confused and tied up with emotions and with karma, kleshas and karma, and I experience samsara. In the case of a Buddha, then all the phenomena of self-awareness manifests in terms of what we call jhanas and kayas, wisdoms and dimensions of enlightenment. So in this way, when we have this consciousness, we have relatively something that is continually experiencing. So beings experience phenomenal appearance according to their mental habit patterns, yeah, on relative truth. And then the idea that everything is in the mind, and you see that a lot. If you look in the Lankavatara Sutra, the Samadhi-Raj Sutra, and so on, this is very often stated, everything is happening in the mind. There's not anything going on out there. It's not as if, as Khenchen Palden Sherab says, as though someone else is directing, manipulating, and imputing these appearances onto our consciousness. They're simply just reflections of our own minds. So we have a projector, and that projector presently is running according to our specific karma, our specific disposition, and freeing ourselves from that is then the objective of the path. But all of that has to do with understanding this mind that we have. So that is, you could say, very real. But then again, within this mind, I mean, we're just talking relative truth here, right? But in that mind, then, yes, then what we experience as external phenomena is in fact just these reflections, projections. So this is where you could say these earlier three, they talked about these aspects, but when we now look at then the nature of phenomena, then we begin to look at their absolute truth, and then we say the countable absolute truth that is verifiable through logic and reasoning. That's one way of understanding reality, and that's where we begin to analyze and see things don't possess the inherent existence we think they have. And then eventually through the path, then we no longer are caught by our projections and our confusion, by our kleshas and karma, and the nature of reality, the uncountable absolute truth, then becomes our, and you could say, experience. We see this. And so that's not something that we can gain through just logic and reasoning. The first has to do with where we're right now. We can actually see, hey, my assumptions, it's just like, it's very politically correct, our way of constructing the other, the enemy, the alien, that's the politically correct way is to not have judgment, the people from the other country. We shouldn't judge them, right? And similarly, any object actually is we cannot judge any objects, but we do, mistakenly. And that's why you could say the politically correct way of seeing the others is in fact based on the insight, the prajna, that these, you could say, rigid assumptions, they're invalid. And that goes for everything. So when we're approaching this countable absolute truth, we're using some just hard intelligence. Yes, we cannot, we cannot attribute solidity, inherent existence on phenomena. So that's something we can learn, but then again, we might meet people, and also in ordinary life who don't have to be convinced that you have to let go of racist attitudes. They're just naturally like that. So what we're doing now is working with wherever we are, and we're working our way towards the absolute realization. Now, this approach of understanding absolute truth through the countable absolute truth analysis and so on, everybody uses it. So as much as we can say it's Svatantrika and everybody else would like to be Prasangika and they're just sort of there, everybody is in fact using the Svatantrika methodology, if you like. Everybody operates naturally with the sense of the two truths. And Khenchen Palden Sherab says almost every great master of Tibetan Buddhism, including those belonging to the Prasangika and Madhyamaka School, teach according to this division of countable and uncountable. So, and then again, I think I've copy-pasted one. Yeah, the same thing. So sorry about that. Some of my... I actually wanted to bring in Khenchen Palden Sherab's some of the things he said. So anyway, let's see, hold on. So I'm going a little bit over time, but we're not that far from the end here. And what follows now will just be a brief summary of what we're going to be studying over the next 2 sessions. But see, everybody who's approaching absolute truth, if people are teaching, any time that anybody just suggests don't be angry, they're going to give some reasons why not to be angry. They might say, oh, it's our past karma. They might also say it's a way of training our mind. And we also might take the view of the other. People might be acting in ways that are not constructive out of their own ignorance, out of their own confusion and being caught by their own karmic patterns. Now, whenever we introduce these, you could say, wider perspectives, we're already introducing ways in which we are beginning to align ourselves with, you could say, the uncountable absolute truth. We're devising methods to understand reality. And so all the time we have we're continually using these, you could say, ways of seeing how things don't exist the way they appear. So you have, in all the different schools, and Khenchen Palden Sherab, he mentions, for example, in the Gelug tradition, you have Lama Tsongkhapa, who would continually teach about the values of no self, and Gorampa also. And so in doing this, it's really important to understand the universality of this. And it's also important that as far as the absolute truth that we're going for, either we go sort of the sort of just saying everything's just a construct and we just leave it at that, wow, or we look, does phenomena have any reality the way we assume they have, and we analyze. Regardless of what approach we adopt, everybody arrives at the same place. And that's where Khenchen Palden Sherab also says, it's important to remember that there is not even a single hair's difference between the Svatantrika and Prasangika views of uncountable absolute truth. Okay, so at this point, there's definitely a sense that uncountable absolute truth is now part of your vocabulary. As far as this nature goes, and this now we're on Prasangika turf in the sense that this is what all the Prasangika is about, but this is also Svatantrika turf, but it's just when it comes to the absolute truth. So uncountable absolute truth. Well, let's say then Chandrakshita will speak just like Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti will do and state that since there's no birth, hey, there's no death. Things have never come into existence. That's speaking about the absolute truth. And also he says all habit patterns of grasping to the four extreme views. And these are that things exist. You know, some people might say, oh, things really exist. Or then they might fall into another extreme saying, oh, nothing exists. Or then some people might say, well, they both exist and they don't exist. Or some will say, oh, they neither exist, nor can we say they don't exist. Now, all of these are just ways of pigeonholing reality. These four extremes, actually, these four that we just say there, existence, non-existence, both and neither, you see, they cover all the various, you could say, styles or the varieties of philosophies that would assert existence, non-existence, or both. But they're just ways of pigeonholing reality. And so we need to understand that phenomena in itself doesn't exist in terms of these narrow classifications. So the uncountable absolute truth makes a point that we need to abandon these kind of ideas in order to actually experience the whole absolute truth. So these views simply reflect the way mundane conceptions perceives reality, and they're deeply rooted in grasping and clinging. And with these views, it means these four extreme views, you know. And we can see it. The 7 o'clock news is full of, you know, factions that are fighting because some believe this, some believe that, you know. And all of these, and it's not just sort of religious crowd, it's also just as much other, you could say, subcultures that have their particular dogma. Jungin Mipham, he says, and this is about uncountable absolute truth, yeah? He just, in order for us to understand this in juxtaposition with the categorized, I inserted this quote. This is from Douglas Duckworth's Mipham on Buddha Nature, and he says, the uncategorized ultimate, free from all assertions, appears as the object of meditative equipoise of a sublime one. That's what we're aiming at here. And the categorized ultimate, the countable ultimate, it appears in post-meditation certainty. Now, what we're looking at is that which is beyond thoughts, the uncategorized or uncountable absolute truth. Yeah, that's beyond any kind of propositions. And then we have the categorized or countable absolute. This is what we think about in post-meditation, means when we're not meditating. So one is what, and you could say in meditation, particularly the Bodhisattva's meditation, that has no assertions. And then there's post-meditation. And even Bodhisattvas there, they operate with ideas. They have what we call, they still have some subtle apprehension of duality and so forth. And that's where we think about things. And in fact, us who practice meditation, we should do like that too. You know, while we're meditating, don't philosophize. Post-meditation, yes, go for it. And you see, when we're meditating, we are, and this is where the quote continues, the former, the uncategorized or uncountable, is the domain of wisdom. And the latter, the countable or categorized ultimate, the latter is the domain of consciousness. So when we're practicing settling into shamatha vipassana, when we're practicing whatever we're practicing in terms of our meditation practice, yes, at that point we're not following after the ordinary discursive mind. We are settling into the domain of wisdom. The latter, honest understanding, thinking about things, that is the discursive mind, and that is the domain then of consciousness. So there's actually a whole book. Next time I'm going to bring along a few book recommendations. There's a whole collection of sort of essays by Western academics called the Svatantrika Prasangika Distinction. And but anyway, here we're just making a very short statement where one is instant, that's the Prasangika, and the gradual is the Svatantrika. So the Svatantrika focus on a gradual approach to the true nature. The Prasangika focus on an instantaneous approach to the true nature. So this means that in the Svatantrika school we teach the countable absolute truth before we move on to the final view of the uncountable absolute truth, as we've established. The Prasangikas immediately jump to uncountable absolute truth, which transcends all reference points and notions of acceptance. They immediately arrive at a definitive understanding of the true nature. So it's a bit like the Prasangikas immediately arrive at the center of the nature without making any distinctions or divisions in terms of approach. And the Svatantrikas first emphasize then the countable absolute truth as a practical tool to arrive at uncountable absolute truth. Now, I just wanted to, I'm going to see, I wonder if this comes later, but there's an important thing also. I just want to go back here just with this one. You see what I think it's Sachin Punlap. Let me just see. Does he say that? Oh yeah. Anyway, see, oh yeah, this is it's going to come up. But you see, when we're going to look at these refutations, that's right. The Prasangikas, we're going to look at. Sorry, it comes up here. Yeah, this the great reasonings. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So here we have 5 great Madhyamaka reasons, and we're going to look at them. But you see, both the Prasangika and the Svatantrika, they use these. But you see, the Prasangikas, when they use these, for example, what we just looked at, the reasoning that takes us beyond plural and singular, eliminating all notions about the absolute nature. That's number 4. When the Svatantrika use that, they use it because they want to understand the absolute nature. See, the Prasangika, they're so outrageous. They don't even want to understand the absolute nature because the absolute nature is not a scope of the reasoning intellectual mind. So they only use these kind of arguments to eliminate the notions of others. They're actually about just, you could say it's very compassionate. They're beyond, and they just destroy any kind of philosophical proposition. And so in the Prasangika context, these great Madhyamaka reasonings, they use just to destroy any, you could say, philosophical reference point, including themselves, but they use to others, So that's why they're called consequentialists. Prasangika means someone who, you could say, shows the absurd consequence of a view. But the Svatantrika, they're more, you could say, earnest, serious love. They sort of want to know what is absolute nature about, and here these reasonings are very helpful. Now, the first of these is the reasoning of the sharp Vajra, and we're going to look at these. It basically is looking at how do things originate, and do they originate? That's the question. And so there's some logic around this. We'll look into this next time. The next is, and it's about originating, The next is about the notion of existence and non-existence. Do things truly exist? Or are they completely non-existent? And of course, we're going to see they're neither existing nor non-existent, and also not falling into any of these extremes whatsoever. So the point there being that we cannot hold on to anything as saying it's existing or non-existent. And then we have 4 corners that eliminate the reasoning of things that exist in terms of cause and results. We'll look at that next time. We'll also, like we looked at this time, looking at the reasoning that takes us beyond plural and singular. And finally, we then have the great reasoning of interdependent or dependent origination, dependent arising. So we're going to look at that next time. Punlap Rinpoche says about the first 4, their refutations, they actually just, you could say, destroy it. The last one also gives us some sense of relative truth, If we understand the law of karma and how things work, then it's very much where we understand dependent arising. So at the end, Khenchen Palden Sherab discusses a little bit about these 2 approaches of the scholar and of the intellectual. Now, if you're following this course, you might think that you're an intellectual. But in fact, everybody is exposed to the yogic way. And so we are actually, all of us, using it, sort of both of these approaches. But we can just be aware that the scholarly way, yes, that is where we use reasoning, we use logic. And like I said before, we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're not people who work on the basis of analysis and critical thinking and logic. That's the scholarly way. Then we have the other one, and this is the way that we understand reality, absolute truth. The yogic student, or the qualified student, yogic way of doing that is very often just from receiving pith instructions. I mean, some of them in the Dzogchen lineage, you have very short pith instructions, and somebody just followed some very basic few words of instructions and attained enlightenment, or just, even in the practices of the Dzogchen Nundro and so on, there's some very simple ways of which we can introduce this uncountable absolute truth. But the bottom line is, whatever we're doing, we end up needing to meditate. Yeah? So then again, you could say there's meditations depending on what kind of person we are. There's the scholarly way, which emphasizes analytical meditation, Qigong, which is, just keep on looking if we can find any self or any object or anything. We're continually analyzing. Or there's the yogi's way of just settling into non-thought, just settling in, as we do in general in Shamatha Vipassana and the Nyingma and Kagyu traditions. We just settle. We don't really have thoughts. Even the Vipassana traditions of Burma and so on, they actually operate with some degree of analytical meditation. But as far as the Nyingma Kagyu way of practicing the settling meditation, just settling into non-thought. But of course, very much with an understanding that's based on both an understanding of the countable absolute truth and uncountable absolute truth. Thank you for hanging in there. And look, when we came around 7 o'clock, there wasn't actually any questions, so I just kept on marching. I hope you can forgive me for doing that. And I'll just take some questions in case they're okay. So, question 1. Is true compassion only possible in the nature of the one who is free of like and dislike? And until the latter is affirmed in experience as well as logic, that the Bodhisattva does the act as if compassionate? Well, look, we would say true compassion is without the notion of self and other. Otherwise, we're thinking, gosh, I'm compassionate to so-and-so, right? There's what we call the three wheels, subject, object, and action, or threefold concept. So yes, until then, we would say compassion is still somewhat tainted by duality. And still, it's here, until the latter is affirmed in experience as well as logic, that the Bodhisattva does the act as if compassionate. Yeah, but as if compassionate, and this is what we then call, just according to relative truth, we would say tainted. Maybe there's still duality, but that compassion is immensely valuable. Yeah? Is compassion itself also an expression of phenomena? Yes. Functioning per appearance and capacity? Yes. It's the natural way of being. When there's not the sort of tightness of clinging to the self, then naturally compassion manifests. And we would say actually all phenomena, outer and inner, in reality are the expression of what we call compassion. If we use the vocabulary of the great perfection, actually we say all phenomena. We refer to all phenomena, all manifestation we refer to as compassion. Yes, the question is, does Dzogchen, Mahā'ati or Mahasandhi, does that fall into the category of Prasangika approach to absolute truth? Yes, it does. It is what's then essentially Dzogchen or Mahā'ati meditation that is uncountable absolute truth, or uncategorized absolute truth. So it falls into that category. Okay. Thank you very much for hanging in there. I apologize going over time, and I'm deeply grateful that you're following this course and hanging in there with the various, it's just tools. We're getting used to some vocabulary, but it's very helpful vocabulary in terms of what we're doing. And yes, relatively, there's some things we need to understand our relative reality with, but we're actually being invited to go beyond. So we're not ultimately burdened with all these words. It's just for the time being, we're a little bit sort of learning the neighborhood. And this is quite helpful street maps in terms of just our experience. Thank you. So, by this merit may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and increase ever more and more. Thank you.